How's everyone doing? We're back in our reading through the Bible here, and I know some of you haven't missed me at all, and a few have, but here I am, um, trying to kind of find that balance with my schedule, and not just kind of trying to come up with things to say, certainly here, but there's a lot to process here throughout these scriptures. And in particular, as we come to a conclusion of Second Chronicles on Monday. So I'll do a discussion today about some things. On Monday, I want to come back with you because as the story comes to an end, it's really an important kind of shift in the story, a big picture piece that a lot of us kind of are vaguely familiar with, but maybe don't understand just how important it is, and that's the idea of the exile. And we saw, at the end of Second Kings, I talked about it, and of course, as we've seen here, First and Second Chronicles does more than that, but also kind of recapitulates some of what's going on in First and Second Kings. And I don't know if you noticed this. I think I mentioned it before. So obviously, a lot of similarities. What are some of the differences? If you were to take the time to study and compare the accounts of these different kings from the books of Kings and the books of Chronicles, you would see a lot of similarities. You would see some differences as well, some more than others. And I've not spent a lot of time doing this. Just some things that were obvious to me. Every now and then I'll flip back and forth because a question will intrigue me about something, but it's a worthwhile study. It's not just exactly the same thing cut and pasted. So there's a little bit more going on there, broader scope, or different portrayal. And I don't know what you guys have noticed and not noticed in this reading is that Chronicles is pretty much solely focused on the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, it's not like the northern kingdom of Israel is just forgotten or unmentioned. They pop into the story, but remember in like Second Kings, the narrative kind of goes back and forth, whoever king of Israel, whoever king of Judah, and they kind of overlap, and it recounts both of the kingdoms' kind of kingship activities until the northern kingdom gets taken over by the Assyrians. And then the southern kingdom of Judah, of course, goes on after that. We're talking about the divided monarchy. Remember, after Solomon, there's Saul, there's David, there's Solomon. After Solomon, his son Rehoboam takes over in Judah, but Jeroboam and the northern tribes break off. So again, just track with the story is helpful. I want to look at today. Title my message. I'm not normally, obviously preaching kind of creeps in a little bit. But I'm thinking about here, what is the real enemy? Who is the real enemy? And so often we think it's somebody or something outside. And in reality, and I think this is true and a good realization for us to think more seriously about, whether it comes to the ancient people of Israel and Judah, or it comes to the New Testament people, the church, the people of Jesus. The biggest challenge or threat to us is not somebody else or something else, but it's ourselves losing our faithfulness, our allegiance to God. For us, of course, to Christ, even more specifically. But when you look at, and again, the same sort of pattern in the books of Kings as in the book of Chronicles, how are the different kings talked about? How are they evaluated? Some are, pretty purely seeming mostly positive. Others are pretty bad. Others change. Others are a mixed bag, which is kind of like, the way things are in the real world today. But it was really important. God held these kings accountable. What they do and don't do affects the rest of the nation. That's always the case with people who have positions of influence, power, leadership, politics, etc. They're held to a higher standard. Teachers, we read out in the New Testament church, right? Because of the influence that they have. And it's really, really important. So as we look through here, some interesting things about, of course, we're used to seeing this a lot now about allowing, putting up with, even actively participating in idolatry. We see more, it seems like even more overtly, again, I'm not comparing back now, but like things getting not like competition with worship of God, but coming into the temple itself, we see happening. And some pretty bad stuff. So let me do, I know I'm kind of overlapping a little bit back, a little bit forward here today. And again, Monday is going to be, I'm going to kind of wrap up where this leaves us in the story in the last few chapters of Second Chronicles. But today in First Chronicles, I just want to kind of do a little flip through a few pages here, starting in chapter 24, and kind of highlight a couple things that are going on with a couple of these different kings, just to really have us kind of soak in or think about what's going on here. At times, how bad it was. What's God holding them accountable for? When do we see God's grace shining through? And these kind of things. This is interesting. So in chapter 24, we have Joash. And we're told, a lot of times in both the Kings and here, we kind of have statements made about the king, kind of overarching statements made about their faithfulness or unfaithfulness or whatever. And we have beginning and ending kind of a pattern, although it's not, 100% the same every time, of course. So Joash, 24 verse 2, did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the years that Jehoiada the priest, all the years of Jehoiada the priest. So Joash is an example of somebody who goes from pretty good to bad. We'll see another example in here of somebody that goes from really bad to quite a bit better. So it's interesting that it's not only one person's life as being one kind of steady thing necessarily of faithfulness or unfaithfulness, but people can go from more faithfulness to very much less. And people who are really jacked up can also change and become much more faithful. So it's really an interesting sort of story. So he did right in the eyes of the Lord as long as this priest was alive. Once he died, things changed. So in verse 4, he decided to restore the temple of the Lord. It's often throughout this, it's interesting how often through the cycle of these kings, how often the temple is restored. I don't know, again, there's, some detail, but very little going on here. Sometimes things are just being ignored. Are things being destroyed? Sometimes these repairs or restorations seem like major remodeling things, and other times they're more kind of like cleaning things up and reestablishing the practices in those kind of things. So we see, Joash being good until he's not, so the priest kind of kept them. This could be a lesson too about people's influence in our lives. But he, after the death of Jehoiada, in verse 17 now of 24 and 18, they abandoned the temple of the Lord, the God of their ancestors, and worshipped Asherah poles and idols. Because of their guilt, God's anger came on Judah and Jerusalem. Although, this is interesting, verse 19, although the Lord sent prophets to the people to bring them back to him, they would not listen. So God didn't just say, hey, I said a long time ago, sent somebody to remind them, hey, but they would not listen. So we can go through. Chapter 25 has Amaziah, verse 2. He did right what was right in the eyes of the Lord, but not wholeheartedly. This is just a fascinating category, right? Again, somebody can do, kind of right, more right, but not wholeheartedly. It's such an. I mean, I should someday do a real search through, an inquiry into the consistency of how these different phrases are used wholeheartedly, what was right, and these kind of things, and the different kinds of sins. Like they're all sins, but there's different kinds of idolatry, different kinds of uh, sinful influence that's allowed in, and they're sometimes called by different words and phrases. It's really fascinating. Um, I think here in this story. Um, Amaziah's I don't know if I've ever pronounced that name before. Am Amaziah, I think. I don't know. So he was good. He's listening to God. Then he defeats these people and brings their gods back. And God's like in verse 34. 14, chapter 25, 14 and following. God says, the prophet says, prophet of God says, why do you consult these people's gods, which could not save their own people from your hand? So he goes, and because of God's help, right, this is how the story goes, defeats these people, and then he takes their gods, their idols, back and sets them up for himself, his own little worship kind of area there. And God sends prophet to say, you beat those guys. Why would you take their gods to worship? It doesn't make any sense, right? So anyway, we could do certainly a whole message on each one of these guys probably, but we're kind of rolling through. Uzziah, we learned about him in Isaiah. I remember in the year the King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, the seat on his throne, high and lifted up. We'll get there in our journey, but that's we probably are more familiar with Uzziah from that than from Second Chronicles. A lot of us anyway. He did what was right, and it's interesting when they're compared to other people too, especially when you look back in the same narrative and that person's story is a little bit more complicated. Again, what is right in his eyes of the Lord? What exactly does that mean? Is a really interesting question. Jotham, chapter 27, he did right what was in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father Uzziah had done. But unlike him, he did not. Oh, so that's a really interesting thing. Actually have this underlined in chapter 26 with Uzziah. Look at that. This is kind of a interesting story. And if you remember back, keep Leviticus in view through this too, because that really matters for some of this. Look at chapter 26, verse 16. After Uzziah became powerful, his pride led to his downfall. Okay, we have this saying we use common language today: pride goes before the fall. There you go. He was unfaithful to the Lord his God. Wait a minute! It just said at the beginning he did right. Okay, well, again, things change. Things can go bad and then good, or good and then bad, and somebody can mess up and come back, like with David. Somebody can start off decent and then get crooked. All of these things can happen because this is real life. These are real people, just like us, but with a lot more power and wealth and authority. So check this out. Verse 16, he was unfaithful to the Lord his God as the king and entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. Now, pop quiz, this should hopefully be obvious by now, but I'm not braiding you if it's not. Well, what's the problem with this king going into worship? He enters the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense, right? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is that he's not a priest. Only the priests enter the temple itself. And Uzziah is a king. Kings are not that kind of priest. And so that's a problem. So the high priest, other priests, verse 17, 80 other courageous priests of the Lord go in. They confronted the king. Now, that's a hard thing to do because the king's the one with, the more power. They confronted him and said, it's not right for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord. That is for the priests, the descendants of Aaron, who have been consecrated to burn incense. Leave the sanctuary, for you have been unfaithful, and you will not be honored by the Lord God. I mentioned this before, I think, but it's really significant, again, to understand the Old Testament story, that there's kind of a triple role of, I don't know what's the right word, if it's leadership's kind of like a word we use today, but there's kings, there's prophets, and there's priests, and all three are important to this story, and none necessarily should have authority over the other, in a pure hierarchical sense. So like we saw like with Nathan the prophet, with David, right? David's the king, but Nathan comes up to him and says, like, this isn't right. Like, what you did is wrong. But like, well, I'm the king. I can do whatever. Well, no, because who's the true king? God, right? God is the king. And so if God sends a prophet, the human king should listen to him. God has established the priesthood. They have that particular role. The king doesn't get the right to usurp that. Now, he can try. He did try. But that's not how it's supposed to work. So fundamentally, this is a big subject matter. But anyway, the king is always, king, everybody else, this is like New Testament, Romans 13, everybody's ultimately accountable to God. God is the king. God is the ultimate authority. Nobody has the authority in God's realm to just do what they want. That's pretty important stuff. Okay? So Uzziah, verse 19, becomes angry while he was, like this translation, while he was raging at the priests in their presence before the incense altar in the Lord's temple. Leprosy broke out on his forehead. Right, he gets the skin disease. Right, and this skin disease kind of comes out right on him. So that's a sign that God says, "Hey, these guys are right, not you." Right? Pride is a devastating problem in our lives and in our world. Right here in this situation. So he had leprosy on the day he died. All right. Jotham, verse 2, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father Uzziah had done. Okay, see what he's talking about. But it says here, chapter 27, verse 2, but unlike him, he did not enter the temple of the Lord. So it's interesting. Like, so, the person who's writing this story, the scripture now here for us, is not just painting with a nicer brush. Uzziah knows that he did this, had just said it. And yet, there's some favorable aspect of him, right? In the grand scheme of things. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father Uzziah had done, but he didn't mess up in this major way. Like him, for chapter 28, Ahaz messed up, unlike David, his father. So isn't this interesting? Again, with Jotham in chapter 27, just like his father Uzziah, and that's literally like his dad. But father can mean like literally his dad, or it can mean like ancestor, people in that kind of big family line. And so chapter 28, Ahaz is contrasted with David. Unlike David, his father, he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He followed the ways of the kings of Israel. Okay, so they're like that negative light overall. And also made idols for worshiping the Baals. He burnt sacrifices in the valley of Ben Hinnom, the Hinnom Valley. And look at this. And sacrificed his children in the fire. This is the king, the representative of God's people. He's not just giving lip service, worshiping idols. He's making the idols. He's not just letting things go. He's actively participating with it. Sacrificed his children in the fire, engaging in the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. Remember back in Genesis? I can't remember the exact reference, but it's something to the effect of, we can't go in the promised land yet because the sin of these people is not bad enough yet, right? We see an example of what that sin was like. This is not just like a pluralistic society. People are sacrificing their kids, child sacrifice. This is part of the reason for the judgment of these nations by God. This is not just petty stuff. And this is a sign of the, so we're moving towards the exile. We're moving towards, remember, God said, this is my land, I'm giving it to you to live in, but you're not going to do whatever you want. If you disobey me to this extent, the land's going to vomit you out. You're done. You don't just get to own it as a possession. You're here as a steward because you're my people, but it's my land. God, not Dan, right? You guys get that. So we can see this trajectory, and it's important to understand in the story. Again, this is not just petty stuff. It's pretty substantial. All right, I need to move. This is I had a long one for a while. 29, chapter 29. Hezekiah. Remember, we saw him as well in Kings, Second Kings. He is one of the much better ones, right? A very good record overall. Chapter 29, verse 2. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. So David is a continual example that's looked back to. And again, we can see doing right does not necessarily mean a pristine record. David did some wrong, although Chronicles doesn't talk about that. The whole of his life was coming back to God, even when he really messed up big time, sinned. He repaired the temple. Again, temple seems to be having problems over and over again. And he kind of calls for this revival of sorts. Removes the defilement of the sanctuary. Verse 6, our parents were unfaithful. They did evil in the eyes of the Lord our God and forsook him. They turned away their faces from God's dwelling place and turned their backs on him. Look at this. I'm in verse 7, chapter 29. They did not burn incense or present any burnt offerings at the sanctuary to the God of Israel. There was a time period where they stopped doing the offerings, the sacrifices. They just didn't do it. This is the king, and this was my point at the beginning here. Who's the real enemy? It's not because they were in exile. It's not because they were in Assyria. It's not because they were in Babylon. It's not because they were under an occupation by somebody else. They stopped doing this purely because they were not faithful to God. This is like us sitting in a church and no one's telling us what to do one way or the other, and we're doing things that are an abomination to God, and we're neglecting the things that he's told us to do. This is terrible. But again, this is the state of the people, and it's their sin. It's nobody else's fault but themselves, their rebellion, their unfaithfulness. This is why the exile is coming. I hope it's coming into clarity for you as you see this. And although there's ups and downs to it, right? There's good times, there's bad times, there's the things. But this is a good moment, and that Hezekiah is saying, "Hey, we're gonna focus back in." But it points out to how bad it was in comparison. And so he offers sacrifices, and they do Hezekiah's story as well. Again, I'm not trying to work verse by verse through this. You're hopefully doing the reading. I'm just pointing out some things that you may or may not have missed. Chapter 30, Hezekiah invites anyone that's left in the northern kingdoms to come and participate with the Passover celebration as well. The end of Hezekiah's life looks like this. Chapter 31, end of it, verse 20. This is what Hezekiah did throughout Judah, doing what was good and right and faithful before the Lord his God. In everything that he undertook in his service of God's temple and obedience to the law and the commands, he sought his God and worked wholeheartily. And so he prospered. Okay? Hezekiah is one of the good ones. And, we're getting towards the end here. And so it's not like it gets, like, I kind of told the story sometimes in the past, like it got progressively worse. But it's kind of like this thing, it's like a downward thing, but it goes up and down a little bit, like a weird stock thing. It gets a little bit better than worse, and a little bit than worse. Hezekiah, is a really strong note. Manasseh, his son, starts evil. He's bad. Chapter 33, verse 2, did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following detestable practices of the nations that had been driven out. He rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had demolished. So he undoes all the revival, repair, restoration that Hezekiah does in worship to God. He undoes a lot of it. He also erected altars to the Baals and made Asherah poles. He bowed down to them. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, my name will remain here. And so in the temple, pagan altars. Okay. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. He took an image he had made, an idol, and put it in God's temple, of which God had said to David, don't do that, Verse 10. Here's a verse. 33 verse 10. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they paid no attention. Didn't listen to what he had to say. So here's the interesting thing. So Manasseh, he's bad right now. Pause for a second. In 2 Kings, Manasseh is bad through and through. But in 2 Chronicles, it records Manasseh has a turnaround. So I mentioned, remember earlier, sometimes starting decent, going bad. Sometimes, there's back and forth and ins and outs. Manasseh has quite a turnaround here in 2 Chronicles. He's bad until he's captured by a foreign army, king of Assyria, brought away in shackles and took him to Babylon. Chapter 33, verse 12. Look at this. In his distress, he sought the favor of his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his ancestors. Now he's sitting here in the nasty result of his own sin and rebellion, right? And he is here and he's realizing, oh crap, here I am, and he humbles himself. Not hard to be humbled when you're knocked down and you're a prisoner. But what's God going to do? I told you so. I told you again and again. You didn't listen. I told you, and you did not listen. That's what Scripture says. What does God do? Verse 13. And when he prayed to him, the Lord was moved by his entreaty and listened to his plea. So he brought him back to Jerusalem and to his kingdom. Wow. God's grace. Woo, there you go. Then, listen to this. This is cool. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord is God. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord is God, right? So he had a experience that he actually followed through with it, right? So sometimes, and I'm going to end here. I think this is into tomorrow's actual reading, so you may not have gotten there yet if you're doing the day-by-day thing. Sometimes we have a moment we're desperate. We pray, God, get me out of this, and I'll do all this, and then it gets better, and then we kind of forget. Here in the story, Manasseh does. He gets rid of the foreign gods, removed the image from the temple as well as the altars. He threw them down. He restored the altar to the Lord and celebrated fellowship offerings. So he followed through in a big way. So look at this. Look at verse 17 now, because I've been wondering about this throughout this story, about these high places. What's going on at the high places? Check out verse 17. The people, however, continued to sacrifice at the high places, but only to the Lord their God. So they're worshiping to God, but in the wrong place, which is a problem. It's not good. But it seems like it's different than worshiping to other gods in the wrong place. That's an even bigger problem. So it's not like, I don't know. So can we rank sin here? I don't know. They're all bad in different ways. So I gave you a lot to think about today already. I'm going to wrap up. So hopefully you feel, if you're feeling neglected by me, not doing as many of these videos, hopefully half an hour in today, 28 minutes, you feel like you're caught up, and we'll see. We'll go from there. So I'm not just trying to show up every day just to show up. Like if it's things that are like, yeah, this feels like we already talked about this, are kind of some of the times too, in addition to just having something on my schedule, it's taking up the day. But I want to make sure that I don't neglect things that help us understand the story, understanding who God is, who he's called us to be, what he expects of us, what's going on in the ins and outs of this big picture story is of deep importance to me, that God's people understand his story, because it's our story. We're living in it in a later chapter. So, all right, guys, have a great weekend. I'll hopefully see you again on Monday.